Good evening. I'm Chris Brown, and I have the privilege of serving as the John and Adrienne Mars Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Welcome to those of you joining us here in person at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, and special greetings to everyone tuning in online. Thank you for joining with us for this year's John H. Glenn Lecture in Space History. This is our premier annual event for exploring the role of space, science, and technology in modern American life. In the decades that we have been holding this lecture, we've talked to inspiring people, celebrated exciting milestones, and explored important topics. This year's program certainly fits the bill. Joining us tonight is a powerhouse panel of notable astronauts. 48 years ago, 1978, NASA selected its most diverse class of astronauts to date. With the goal of selecting mission specialists who would run experiments in space and exercise the new capabilities of the Space Shuttle orbiters, NASA expanded the call for astronaut candidates. Among that historic group of 35 new guys were the first women and people of color selected by NASA as astronaut candidates. Three of those women from the class of 1978, Drs. Anna Fisher, Rhea Seddon, and Kathryn Sullivan, are with us here tonight to share their experiences as trailblazing astronauts. Unfortunately, NASA Deputy Administrator and former astronaut Pamela Melroy is unable to join us due to, as we had planned, to moderate the panel, and sends her sincere regrets. Before we get started, I'd like to extend my thanks to the sponsor of tonight's program, the Boeing Company. Please join me in thanking Boeing for their generous support of this museum and our educational programming. And with that, I would like to now invite Dr. Margaret Weitekamp to introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion. Dr. Weitekamp is curator of the Social and Cultural History of Spaceflight here at the museum and is the chair of our Department of Space History. She's been with the museum for 20 years and is the author of, among other things, Right Stuff, Wrong Sex, and Space Craze. Margaret.
Thank you very much, Director. This evening, I am honored to introduce the panelists for the Glenn Lecture in Space History, Dr. Anna Fisher, Dr. Rhea Seddon, and Dr. Kathryn Sullivan. Our panelists tonight are talented professionals whose many accomplishments include being 3 of the 6 first women selected by NASA as astronaut candidates, a part of the historic class that called themselves the 35 New Guys in 1978. Dr. Anna Fisher, who's sitting in the middle, earned her bachelor's degree in chemistry as well as a doctorate in medicine from the University of California, Los Angeles. She also earned a master's degree in chemistry in 1987, also from UCLA. Building on her experience as a chemist and doctor specializing in emergency medicine, Dr. Fisher supported Space Shuttle integrated testing and payload testing at NASA's Kennedy Space Center from STS-5 through STS-7. She was a mission specialist on STS-51A aboard the Space Shuttle Orbiter Discovery, which is here at the Udvar-Hazy Center. That was in 1984. During that mission, Fisher logged 192 hours in space as the crew deployed 2 satellites and retrieved 2 others from orbit, completing the first space salvage mission. From 1996 through 2002, during the early phase of building the International Space Station, she was working as the chief of NASA's Space Station branch. She also served as an ISS capsule communicator, or CAPCOM, working in the Mission Control Center between 2011 and 2013. She ended her NASA career as a management astronaut, working on display development for the Orion multi-purpose crew vehicle and supporting European payloads for the ISS integration branch, before she retired from NASA in 2017. This fall, she's teaching a new course at the University of Southern California's School of Engineering. From an ER doc, we move to a general surgeon. Dr. Rhea Seddon earned a degree in physiology from the University of California at Berkeley and received her MD from the University of Tennessee College of Medicine in Memphis, where she completed her general surgery residency. Dr. Seddon spent 19 years with NASA. She served as a mission specialist on space shuttle flights in 1985, also aboard Discovery, for, this time on STS-51D, and in 1991, and as the payload commander in charge of all science activities on her final flight in 1993. In total, she spent 30 days in space. After leaving NASA in 1997, Dr. Seddon became the Assistant Chief Medical Officer of the Vanderbilt Medical Group in Nashville for 11 years. There, she led an initiative to improve patient safety and quality of care using an aviation-based model of crew resource management. Then she helped to found Life Wing Partners, which teaches this concept to healthcare institutions across the country. Her memoir, Go for Orbit, won the Independent Book Publishers Association Ben Franklin Gold Award for Best Autobiography or Memoir. Our final panelist, Dr. Kathryn Sullivan, is a geologist and oceanographer who was the first American woman to walk in space, the first woman to dive in a submersible to the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, the deepest spot in the Earth's oceans, and is the first and only person to do both. She flew on 3 space shuttle missions, including STS-31. We always have to mention if it was Discovery, which it was, during which the crew deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. Her post-NASA positions are equally impressive. She served as the inaugural director of the Battelle Center for Math and Science Education Policy in the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. She is also the former president and CEO of Ohio's Center of Science and Industry, COSI. She has served our country as Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and as administrator for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Equally important to us, she's a recipient of the museum's trophy, now the Collins Trophy for Current Achievement, sharing that award with the late NASA astronaut, Captain Bruce McCandless. And in her term as the museum's Lindbergh Chair as a senior scholar in 2017, she produced her book, Handprints on Hubble, which is out with MIT Press. So it's a wonderful panel. I'm excited to get started and to get to talk to all of you. So I'll start with an easy, when and where did you 3 meet?
Probably when we were all sort of introduced to the public in a large gathering, the 35 new guys. Now there's something incongruous about 35 new guys because we weren't all guys. 6 of us were women. So, you know, that was when we first got together.
Yeah.
Shortly thereafter, we went to our first all-astronaut meeting. And, you know, they looked at us, we were quite young, and we looked at them because we thought they were quite old. So anyway, that got us off to a good start, and we have enjoyed each other's company for a long time.
Yeah, our moniker, 35 New Guys, each new class is supposed to pick a moniker for their group, and some of them are, you know, quite fun, like the Bugs and the funky names like that. We spent a week trying to come up with something clever that incorporated the notion of 35 and failed. And it turns out there's a military acronym, TFNG, which stands for the effing new guy. And we said, well, 35, you know, it fits, and so that's how we became the TFNG.
Yes.
Did you always think you would be an astronaut? Did you want to be an astronaut? Can you talk to me a little bit about your background and how it was that you came to be a part of that illustrious group?
Sorry, you go ahead.
I was never explicitly aiming at that. I the lives of the early astronauts, and for that matter, the aquanauts like Jacques Cousteau, who were doing a lot of intriguing things at the same time when I was like 9, 10, that kind of time frame. That inspired me. These were people that had lives that seemed intrinsically adventurous and inquisitive. And I knew I would like my life to be like that. I didn't really know what does that mean you do at that stage, but find a path to that kind of direction is, I think that might be me, is what really was motivating me. And then I just kept finding my way forward through different academic fields, and eventually the NASA opportunity popped very unexpectedly onto the radar screen.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Fisher.
Well, you know, the career of astronaut didn't even exist when I was a little girl. That was all in the realm of science fiction. And my father was in the military, and we were stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And I was 12 years old, and I listened to Alan Shepard, one of the first American to fly in space, and one of the Mercury 7 astronauts. And as I listened to him, I said, that's what I want to do someday. But of course, didn't seem like a very realistic goal, since all the astronauts at that time were male. They were test pilots, and women weren't even allowed the opportunity to fly high-performance jets and become test pilots. So it didn't seem like a very realistic goal, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. And when years later, I was in my medical training, and a good friend of mine in medical school told myself and that the career of astronaut that NASA was looking at only for pilots, but mission specialists, I knew immediately that's what I wanted to do, and applied right away, and was very fortunate to be in the first group of women interviewed with Ray, and then about 6 months later found out I was very fortunate to be in that first group of astronauts. So it all happened really quickly, and it was like a dream come true.
Well, you know, when I look back on my life, there's some things that happen to you that you don't really realize at first what's just happened, and then you find out, wow. I can remember, you know, growing up as a little girl in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and one night my father took me out in the backyard, and he said, Ray, look up. See that little light blinking across the sky? That's something called Sputnik, and it's the first man-made machine to orbit the Earth. And I said, Daddy, do you think people will go into space someday? And he said, yeah, probably. And I said, do you think I could go into space? And he said, yeah, baby, I just bet you could. So there was a great dad that didn't say, girls don't do that, or you're too little to do that. So here he was telling me, actually kind of giving me permission to achieve something as amazing as that. So I was very, very lucky. But I will always remember that moment in my life when the permission was given to me to become an astronaut.
That's wonderful. Was there a moment when you all met the whole group of 35 before the big public announcement, or was that the first chance to put everyone together? Talk to me about that press conference. Was absolutely historic. And I was wondering about, did you have a chance to kind of get to know each other a little bit before that, or was that your real introduction not only to the world but to each other?
Well, I don't remember that much about that day, other than the fact that I was finally going to get to achieve the thing that I really wanted. But it was so much fun to meet 34 other people who had the same dreams and same desire to do what we were doing. That afternoon, I think some of us went off and were talking about how we were going to talk to the reporters and take pictures and things. But luckily, like I said, I had met Ray before, and I also had met Judy and Sally privately. So when we first got together, it wasn't the first time. It was the first time I met you, I think, Kathy. But it was a really special moment, because I know you probably have the same feeling, but up until then, most of the time, I was the only female in most of my classes, and in higher level classes in chemistry and then in medical school. So all of a sudden I had 5 other women that were there with me. So that was a really neat feeling.
I was in graduate school in Nova Scotia, in fact, when I got the word that I was selected. So needless to say, there's not other American astronauts hanging around there. It was very sort of isolating. I remember seeing a few bits of press coverage of Anna, you and Sally and Judy having a chance to get together in LA sometime before we all went to Houston, and thinking, oh, that'd be so cool to get to meet some of these people. But yeah, I think I met all of you guys. Take it back, I had met Sally informally in California a few weeks before we went down to Houston. And we discovered when we got to Houston and had more time to compare notes that we had actually been in the same first grade class together way back when. So there's a little, winding paths. But otherwise, for me, it was, look at all these people. I mean, I grew up flying little Cessnas, little airplanes. I'm now walking among the most stupendously good pilots in the universe. It was sort of, I know how to fly a Cessna.
Now, you both came in as medical doctors. Did you know how to fly? Do you have interest in flying as well? And how was that introduced?
I had started taking flying lessons because I had just finished my year of internship at Harbor General, the hospital where they took Tiger Woods when he had his accident a few years ago. And I had started taking flying lessons, but it was just a little Cessna 152. And then all of a sudden we come to NASA and we get to fly in T-38s, which was really cool. Yeah, so.
Again, I had a really good father, and as I was finishing college, I asked for a birthday present if he would give me flying lessons, just enough to get my private pilot's license. So once again, there he was, looking out for me and knowing that someday that might be an important thing in my life.
Now, you all came on board at NASA at the beginning of a new category of astronaut, right? So we had pilot astronauts and scientist astronauts, but this was the beginning of having mission specialists and bringing in people with different kinds of degrees and backgrounds. What are the ways that you were best prepared for the new job description that you got of being an astronaut candidate? Were there things that were a real surprise to you? Can you be prepared for taking on the job of astronaut candidate?
Kick off, Ray.
Well, I certainly thought that medical training was probably the best training. I didn't realize it at the time, but in retrospect, it was probably the best training for being an astronaut because that training was so grueling. So many nights you're up 36 hours with no sleep at all. At least NASA, when you look at a flight plan, gave you 8 hours of sleep. And so I thought that coming in as a medical doctor just really had given you a lot of both preparation and confidence. The confidence that as you come into medical school and then you suddenly, or not suddenly, but over several years become a doctor and realize that you really have learned to do this very difficult field, gives you a sense of confidence. And although being a doctor and being an astronaut are two different things, I think that preparation was invaluable. It made everything else look relatively easy in comparison.
Ray, how well prepared did you feel for this new job description of being an astronaut candidate?
Well, I don't think that I felt I was very well equipped just yet. But I knew that there were parts to being an astronaut that would hold me in good stead, in whatever career I decided to be in. But it was all that hard work that you had to do. And when you've got people's lives in your hand, you have to work really hard. And you get really attached to your patients. I mean, there are people that look up from a hospital bed at you and, they say, "Doctor, am I going to be okay?" And, that's a great responsibility to take on. And I think again, that was something that I felt like I really had to work at for the good of my patients.
Yeah, I think I had a set of growing up experiences that gave me a starting step on it. My dad was fairly adventurous, flew small airplanes, liked to go fishing, and he involved both my brother and I in thinking all those things through, planning them. What are we going to take? What are we going to do? And if something invariably doesn't fall according to plan, we were part of the thought process of how do you adapt. So he started developing those adaptation muscles in it with very small steps in very early age. So I was familiar around small airplanes. And my own work as an earth scientist was actually oceanography. So I had, by the time we were selected, five plus years of planning oceanographic expeditions that were going to go far offshore for weeks at a time. You've got to be completely self-sufficient, figure out the navigation at sea in the era before satellite navigation, really. And again, adapt when the weather comes in or this or that goes wrong. So I think that expeditionary experience and the operational experience around small boat voyages and airplanes served me very well. Where I was really grotesquely underprepared, in my case, was on the, figuring out how to get in and be an effective part and then maneuver within a very large organization. Even graduate work in Canada, you really didn't have to do some of the kind of maneuvering and proposal work that is commonplace in graduate education in the United States. So I basically had only ever had to look after me, my work, my equipment, my results, and not figure out the jigsaw puzzle, if you will, of a large organization. So as I look back on that now, I mean, clueless is a kind word for what I was those first couple of years.
Well, an important part of what you were doing was getting used to technologies and the redundancies that are always necessary when you're working with something, and you want to make sure that we're getting it right. So thank you very much for fresh mics. That'll be a little less poppy than the ones that we've had. So, and a good adaptation. So I've asked about how ready were you for NASA. How ready was NASA for 6 women astronaut candidates?
C+. A lot of the forethought, a lot of the engineering forethought that I think went into trying to be ready for us was by necessity done by male engineering teams in their 40s and 50s. So the suitability for young women in their late mid-20s to early 30s was a little low. And culturally, I certainly didn't have any absolutely directly get out of here, you don't belong. But you could walk into a room that there'd only ever been men in that room, and representing the astronaut corps. Now you walk in, and you can see some folks, why is that girl sitting at the main table? You just have, hold your own, be wise enough probably to introduce yourself to the chairperson of the meeting. And in my case, they were mostly very gracious, and they would announce to the room, this is Dr. Anna Fisher, she's representing the crew. And that gave you the footing that you then could work from.
Mm-hmm.
I really felt that NASA went out of their way to at least try to make us feel welcome, much more so than in medicine, because at the time that I was in medicine, it was still pretty rare for women to be a doctor. But NASA, I think, had made the commitment to take women, and although when we came, I think it was still pretty much a predominantly male environment. Like, if you looked at mission control when we first got there, it was almost exclusively male. Looked like back in the Apollo days of mission control. But and now today it's just amazing. You look at mission control, and there's just every flavor and ethnicity and everything. So, but I think NASA had made the commitment to take women, and I felt that there were a lot of little funny things that came up, but at least I personally felt welcome, and that they were trying to help us succeed, not hoping that we would fail.
Talk to me about the equipment. I know there are stories. How did spacesuits, did spaceflight, did the work of being an astronaut need to be adapted when you bring women's bodies into the room, when you bring more diverse body types into the room?
No.
I can remember
because I'm kind of on the small size. And, the crew equipment was way too big for me a lot of the time. I can remember, and a lot of times the people that equipped us gave us our equipment. They just gave us, a certain size. And I can remember, sometimes they don't know what they don't know. I can remember walking out to the flight line, to get in the T-38 jet, and there was a crew equipment person behind me, and he said, whoa, 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 wait, come back here. And he noticed that one of the shoulder straps on my parachute was coming off my shoulder. And he realized that, and he said to me, hey, wait, we gotta make this smaller. We gotta pull this together. Let's go back to the equipment shop and get you into the right-sized parachute. Because had you bailed out wearing that parachute and were head down, you slipped right out of the thing and you'd have died. And that sort of reminded me that you have to have a lot of people looking out for you, to just notice those small things that could be very dangerous. I mean, when you first get into all of this stuff, you don't know anything. You just kind of have to count on these other people to really see what's going on and make sure that you're right. So, all along the way, at least for me and a small-sized person, I had to have people looking out for me, and I looked out for other people too. If I noticed something was wrong, I'd pull someone aside and say, hey, wait a minute, let's go back over here and figure this out, because, you don't want to get hurt. You want to do everything just right, and, everybody will be much better off for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of my first assignments, or my first assignment after we finished our year as candidates, was to work in the area of spacesuits and spacewalks. They didn't even have a shuttle suit available at that time, so I used Pete Conrad's Apollo suit because he was the shortest of the Apollo astronauts, but it really did not fit very well. I looked like a Pillsbury doughboy in this suit, but it was a great way to get started. It turns out that getting a suit that is functional to fit the smaller people is quite a challenge. We tried really hard to design and make a extra small and a small suit, and eventually NASA came to the conclusion that was difficult. It was solvable, but it was going to cost a lot more money, and so they made the decision that you had to fit in the medium or the large hut, the shuttle suit. But we're working now, and hopefully in the next generation suit, they'll be able to come up with one that fits the smaller of the crew members. But Kathy has a lot of experience in that area.
Well, but interestingly, we had never compared notes on this, Anna. My experience in the suit starts in the same suit that you were in, and let me just point out, we're not the same size, but for our first introduction to working underwater in a suit, they still only had, Apollo suits left over, and they looked at me and said, yeah, you're sort of like Pete Conrad too. I probably had one little bit harder in Pete's suit because I think I'm a little taller from crotch to shoulder, and you've got to put two halves of a suit together. So if it's sized to Pete Conrad and you're a little taller, that's not going to be fun. And you had to, at the time, walk in a 100 and some odd pound suit, not quite as far as the podium to get in the tank. So that was a horrible start to the suits for me. But even when we went to the shuttle suit, which was basically a Mr. Potato kind of suit, we build segments for lower legs and upper legs and lower arms and upper arms, and measure you, and then pick the size range in each of those pieces that would stack up to be the closest possible fit to you. And I don't think that suit ever really fit anybody perfectly. But my elbow was never at the elbow, which meant it took extra force to move my arm every time I needed to move my arm. And the knee, where the suit wants to bend for the knee, it's like 3 inches away from where my knee wants to bend. So that, and to Anna's point about fitting smaller frame people well, all of that means that you're having to work X% harder. in the suit to do the job that someone with a longer limb or closer fit on the joints, that friction isn't there for them. Now, the funny places, of course, where their initial judgments were the most far off, no surprise, were on feminine hygiene products. Who's going to want, what goes into the toiletries kit for women astronauts? If we know what goes in the men's kits, what are these people going to want? And on and on and on.
Yes, I had the job of polling all of us to figure out what these 6 very different women wanted, who wanted makeup, who did not want makeup, who wanted, what different sorts of things. That was one of my first interesting assignments.
Because you all started with assignments on the ground. I mean, I think we often think of the job of astronaut entirely as mission-focused and on mission.
But I think even astronauts who are there today, I mean, if you canvass us, I was there 15 years, Anna 19, Ray about 15 or 16, and have 3 weeks in space max. So the bulk of your job and the bulk of your time is on the ground. And the cycle, as I describe it, is you're either training, you're supporting someone else's flight or training for your flight or flying, and you go back to that rotation again. And there are a lot of astronauts are farmed into lots of roles to be the eyes and ears and proxy for the folks that are in orbit now or that are going to train for the next crew and help force multiply for them because they need to stay focused on their training.
So what were some of your most interesting ground assignments?
Well, as I said, my first assignment was working in the area of spacewalks and spacesuits, but then I worked in the facility where we verify our software for the shuttle, worked as a Capcom, the person in mission control that talks to the crew on board. And there's a group of us that are assigned to the Kennedy Space Center to follow the flow of the various orbiters and support payload testing. And so, but all those ground jobs are actually, they're not like formal training, but it really is important training because you, in each of those assignments, you learn lots of important things that's going to eventually help you be a better crew person.
I think one of the important things you get in all those jobs, it's kind of like aiming to become the CEO of a company, but starting in the mailroom. And so you get a really detailed understanding of, of the technology, but also of the mindset, the philosophy, and how that piece of the puzzle sort of administratively and as a team, how does that fit into the whole?
Mm-hmm. But then you do get to go into space. How does that feel?
Fabulous.
Getting assigned to a crew is just the greatest feeling in the world, and going into space is just as amazing as you could imagine. I hope if any of you have a spare $20 million, get to have that experience, but I'm sure that in the future the cost will come down. But going into space is truly an unbelievable experience. And I wish more of our politicians had a chance to go into orbit and see the Earth from the vantage point that we've had the opportunity to see, because I think you would start to think more of yourself as a person from planet Earth as opposed to your individual country, and perhaps we would learn to get along a little better and take care of our planet. Mm-hmm.
How do you find out about a crew assignment, a flight assignment? Do you have a memory of the first flight assignment?
Of course. You're doing all of these jobs and doing all this work, and you hope that you've done well, and that at some point, somebody has to make a decision. And that person, for us, was George Abbey. And you knew, you sort of waited for his phone call. And he would invite you to come over and say, how would you like to do this flight? I don't think there was anybody that ever turned down, no, George, we don't want to do that. But, it was always amazing. And, people would watch you come back to the astronaut office with a big smile on your face, knowing that you had received your first flight assignment, because that was such an awesome thing to have happen to you. And Mr. Abbey was pretty good about, knowing what each person could do and what they were capable of, and where they would fit into the slot of all the people that he was sort of the boss of. And, you know, sometimes he made a mistake in putting the wrong person on a flight crew. But for the most part, he did a pretty good job of it. And, you know, as we began each to receive our flight assignments, you know, we knew that somewhere down the line, we were going to get a chance to fly. And so we were very excited about that.
Mine was a little unusual in that just before I was assigned to my flight, I was the lead person at what we call the Cape Crusaders, the people who are assigned for a year or two to work at the Kennedy Space Center, following the flow of the orbiters and supporting payload testing. And I was the lead actually for Sally's flight. And then when I came back to Houston from that time, and I'll add, I was about 8.5 months pregnant at the time. And so when I flew back to Houston, and George, Mr. Abbey, called me into his office, said he was thinking about assigning me to a flight. And I'll have to admit, I was frankly very shocked. I mean, I was 8.5 months pregnant, but there was no way I was going to say no to that. And so I said, sure, send me in, Coach. And so that when the crew was announced, then my daughter Kristen, who's here in the audience somewhere, I can't see with all the lights, she was born on a Friday morning, and the next Monday I was at the pilots meeting that we always have. Not so much to try to show that I was some super person or whatever. Ray had already demonstrated that. She had her son Paul about a year before me. But I just wanted everyone to know that although I had just had a baby, there was no way I was not going to be on that crew and do that. And so it was a sort of unusual, but I still take it as a vote of confidence that he felt that I could do that. Have a new baby and train for your space flight all at the same time. And it was one of the hardest years of my life, but also one of the best, because I was doing the two things I love most, you know, being a mom to my daughter Kristen, and then going into space, getting ready to go into space.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a little more background color commentary on Mr. Abbey might be helpful here, because
Yeah.
he's notoriously laconic style. George was also the person that called each of us at the end of the selection process. He was the boss, so he got the fun of calling the people that were going to get the happy phone call, and his deputy got the assignment of telling all the other people no. And I answered the phone in my dumpy little graduate school apartment in Nova Scotia, and the level of excitement in George's voice was about as if he was inviting me to come bag groceries at the corner store. And it was sort of, wondering if you maybe were still interested in coming to work for us. And I mean, I literally took the phone away from me. You know, my life is turning inside out, upside down in wonderful ways, and this guy sounds that unexcited. and that was also kind of his style generally. Certainly my first flight assignment was very much that same slightly muttering, low-key style. And again, your mind is spinning forward in all the ways that this is fabulous and your life is going to change, and he's just...
Anna mentioned about, you know, having kids. Mm-hmm. And, you know, all of us had to deal with, if we had children, how are we going to take care of them? And we often, you know, compared notes as to what we could do and how we could help each other and what we had learned from each other. And, you know, that was really important to me because, you know, I was matriculating mostly with men, and they didn't know about taking care of babies. And so, you know, we all had to learn from each other and support each other, you know, so that we could all, you know, do this job together and, you know, show the world, I guess, that it could be done to have children. You know, we had to cobble together whatever we could to get good child care for our husbands, for our babies. Maybe our husbands too. But, we had to cobble together, how we were going to do this. I remember, just tearing my hair out. Here was baby Paul, and he had almost died when he was born, just being born. And so he was kind of a fragile baby for a while there. By the way, because he was the first child born to an astronaut. He claims to have been the world's first astronaut. But we all had to figure out how to get our children well taken care of. I had a variety of different things. I had a babysitter, even had a French girl, an au pair girl, come and stay. But each of those things was a difficult transition for my baby and difficult transition for me. But I was lucky that a wonderful lady appeared in my life. She was an older lady whose children had pretty much grown up already. And here she was. Her name was Joanne Powell. She appeared at my door one day, and she says, "I think I can help you take care of that baby." I was lucky that I lived in a house near the Space Center, and it was a really good-sized house, so it had room for a nanny. So she came and lived with us for a number of years. We still keep in touch with her. But that was one way, God bless her soul, that I could do my job and know that my child was being well taken care of and would grow up to be a successful person.
Speaking of that kind of support, could you talk to me a little bit about how you've been a mentor or who mentored you as you were coming into this career or through this career?
I really didn't have, certainly not any female mentors, because there was pretty much mostly males in the areas I was in. But I was really fortunate in having some wonderful male mentors who, starting with some of my teachers in high school that were amazing, a professor in chemistry at UCLA who wound up writing my letters of recommendation to become an astronaut, and my research advisor that I worked with, and they were all wonderfully supportive. And it's really interesting now, all these years later, because I've had because I was with NASA for such a long time, I had the opportunity to watch all these other young women come through the program. And I don't know if you remember, Ray, but when we were having that dinner, when we were before the tree planting for Sally, and there was really a representative from every group thereafter, and this would have been in 2012, I think it was. And we would go around the table, and each of us got to say something, and so Ray and I we were from the class of 78, and they went around, and then I remember Kate Rubins, one of the newer astronauts that came into the class, say, "Well, she was born in 1978." That didn't go over so well. But it was really amazing, because several of the women who came in later talked about how they wrote to us for letters and autographs and so forth. And here are these young women that are now your colleagues, and you're working with them. And, I don't think any of us wanted to be an astronaut because we wanted to be a role model. It just kind of came along with the territory. But to realize that you did have that influence on these people, and now here some of these young women that were young girls that you wrote to, that you were actually able to have an influence. And it's a really neat feeling to have been able to do that.
I think what Anna just said touches a point that I find really important, which is I think nowadays when we say, "Did you have a mentor?" it carries a bit of an implication of someone who agreed to meet with you weekly or had very structured or formal conversations. And we had a couple of one or two senior astronauts who kind of helped nurture our class at the beginning, and a flight instructor that was helping get us through the flying syllabus. But I think everyone around me, our classmates and the more experienced people, if you watch them and paid attention to how are they going about their work, how are they handling issues, they're modeling good behaviors. And again, me being very new to large organizations and to what was really sort of a military squadron-like culture, that was a lot of how I learned, was just occasionally screwing up and stubbing my toe. But there were models around that you could look at and say, okay, that's a better way to pattern things. That's a better way to go about this part of the work. And then crewmates, you're helping each other learn your way through all the particulars of your flight, because you're going to be backing each other up. You're going to be supplementing each other. I might be leading on something, but Anna's going to be my -2, helping make sure, sit on my shoulder, make sure I get it right, and I'll be her -2 for something else. So you're really cross-training with each other in a really detailed and rich way.
Before I give folks a chance to ask questions through the QR codes, whether they're online or with us here today, I wanted to ask you each, what are you most proud of in your time with NASA or since?
Top of my list would be the chance that I had to be a part of Team Hubble and get the Hubble telescope ready for orbit, and most importantly, get the tools and equipment ready that enabled it to be fixed and repaired on orbit. And we knew before we carried Hubble to orbit that every astronomy book any of us had ever had in college was going to have to be burned soon after Hubble started working, because it promised to be so revolutionary. And it has more than exceeded that. It has run for more than twice the intended life, and that's down to the foundational work we did, but the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who came along with us and after and carried it forward.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of have two things that I really look back on. I certainly am very proud of my crewmates and our flight, because we did something that had not been done before, and I think laid the groundwork for the beginning of the space station, holding these being able to handle these very large, very heavy objects in orbit, that kind of showed that yes, you can do that, and led the way to being able to build the amazing International Space Station. And then when I had a chance to be the leader in the office for the early days at the building of the space station, that is also right almost up there with my flight, because it was very interesting to try to figure out how we were going to work with all of our international partners, and particularly at that time, the Russians, people weren't sure how that was all going to work out, and being able to build those bonds and those friendships and professional relationships that even now, with everything that's going on with the war in Ukraine and that difficulties that we're dealing at the high political levels, the space station continues to operate. The two mission controls continue to work together, and to see that space kind of transcends even these political differences, to me is a really special memory. So I'd say the flight and being part of this amazing group of women, and then setting the groundwork for our international cooperation.
Dr. Seddon.
I guess I'm changing course a little bit here, but, when I look back on some of the important things that I did, having a medical background, it helped me see that there were things that were happening in space that made it difficult for the astronauts to perform their jobs well. For instance, when we first started flying people in space, they frequently got sick at their stomach when they went into space. Everything would come back up, and it happened pretty quickly. You get to zero gravity, and all of a sudden, you're ready to throw up. And that was definitely something that, was going to ruin your day, and probably everybody else's day, if you can imagine. And they tried doing all kinds of bizarre things, like rotating you in a chair, teaching you biofeedback, all this kind of stuff. And so here were all these people scrambling around trying to figure out, how to not throw up. Interesting thing, if people knew they were going to throw up, they'd have a barf bag stuffed in this pocket right here. They could pull it out real quickly if they needed it. But they were trying all kinds of unusual things, and quite early on, I said, this is probably something that we can treat medically. And, so we cobbled together something called Scopedex, scopolamine and dexedrine. Scopolamine to slow your stomach emptying, and dexedrine to wake you up a little bit. So, each of us found something that we could focus on, that we had a background in, that we could, contribute to the Space Shuttle program. And there were a number of things like that in the medical world to help make the transition or the journey something that made it easier for the astronauts to live and work in space, and help others perhaps on the ground with that same kind of innovation.
Well, I have a few questions that are coming to us. Both Janine from Virginia and Kirkland from DC are asking about the 1970s was such an important decade for women's rights and advancement. Were you thinking about that fact that you were blazing trails, or was that simply a result of doing your job?
For me, it was just a result of doing the job. I never pursued something because it was a first, or I could be a first. It was just for the interest, for the value, for the purpose of new knowledge in the case of my oceanographic work. And I believed deeply, and still do, that there's a genuine and rich value to our country and to humankind of spaceflight, and of learning how to help people live and work in space over extended periods of time. And to be part of that in any role, however big or small, was just a really wonderful thing to get to do. And it never mattered to me if I was the first or the 984,000th person to do it. It was a first for me. The experience was novel, and I had real faith and confidence in the value of what we were doing.
Yeah, I don't think any of the six of us went into this career for that purpose. We all were trying to follow our different pathways, to follow our dream or something that we wanted to do, and it just came as a kind of a byproduct of the fact that we were the first. But it really was, and I really never thought that much about it, until, I like at that dinner where they're saying that they wrote to us and we sent them pictures, or when I talked to my daughter now, who has a pretty demanding career, and she said it never occurred to her that she couldn't have a demanding career and be a mom, because I had done it. And so you don't go into it for those reasons, but it's a really nice secondary benefit, I would say.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question from the audience here in the room. Did you listen to music on the way up to space?
Not on the way up.
You're a little busy on the way up.
Well, the Russians actually let you pick music that you play during the count. Not during as you're launching, but before then, which I think is a really neat thing. I wish we had been able to do that too. But we each were able to. Back then we didn't have iPods and iPhones and all that sort of stuff. So Sony Walkmans. So we had Sony Walkmans where we put music on, and I remember, the days were very busy, 16-hour-long days, but we would always, once we were getting ready for the next day, take maybe an hour or so as we went around the Earth to look out the window and listen to some music. And I can still remember, listening to these amazing things. And one memory that really pops into my head is my commander said, "Hey, Anna, come over here and listen to this." And he was listening to Crosby, Stills and Nash, When You See the Southern Cross, for the first time. And I looked over at the world map, and we were just crossing the equator and saw the Southern Cross for the first time from space. So music is really a neat thing to enhance your enjoyment.
Alex from Baltimore wants to know, can you share a story of how you successfully navigated a challenging moment in one of your missions?
Well, not in the mission per se, but I remember I was the arm operator on my flight, and we have to operate the arm in its full up computer-supported mode is not that difficult, but we also train to operate the arm single joint. And I remember I went over to the simulator and I was supposed to berth the satellite single joint, one joint at a time. So imagine moving your arm and you have to move it one joint at a time. And I spent a 2-hour session over there, and I was not able to do it. And my trainers weren't able to tell me something to help me. And I went away, and I was so discouraged. I'm going, oh my gosh, I'm just assigned to this flight, and now, I can't do this thing that I'm supposed to do. So I sat down and thought about it. And I went over to one of the computer models, and I watched how the computer brought the arm down. And so every 10 inches, I would write down all the joint angles. And then I'd go down another 10 inches, write down the joint angles and so forth. And finally, and you could see that predominantly one joint or the other was moving. And so when I finished that, I made this little cue card, and I ran over to the simulator, and I did it in 5 minutes or something, and so no trainer taught me how to do that. But it's like, when it's your career on the line and you have to do something and you want to make sure that you're going to be able to do all the things that your commander and your crewmates expected of you, you really figure out a way to do that. And I flew that cue card just in case.
So my memorable incident did happen on orbit, and the largest payload on my first flight was a very long synthetic aperture radar antenna, as long as the space shuttle payload bay is long, basically. And that would be too flimsy to have it launched that way, so it folded like a 3-fold sandwich and clamped itself together. And that was my primary payload to operate, so I'm carefully going through unlatching the latches, which I've done on the real antenna on the ground a couple dozen times. It's been modeled in the simulator, so we've all seen this many times. But on the day, as soon as I let the latch that held the top leaf down and closed the whole sandwich, there must have been a little tension on the spring on that hinge. And so the top leaf starts flapping like this, and the whole 3-leaf sandwich stack starts flapping like this. And there were, Sally and Bob Crippen and I are all at that aft window, and I think every eyeball was 6 inches diameter, and visions of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge shaking itself until it falls apart are flashing through our heads. And there was a little idiosyncrasy that you couldn't command the next motor until every micro switch said everything's in the position it needs to be in. And it was only in all that position every few seconds as the pieces kind of landed. So, we had really no knowledge what to do with this, but to not let it go on for too long. So when the micro switches all landed at one point, I started driving the next leaf open, and that made everything just stiff enough it settled right down. But it was sort of, I think this is the end of my career.
Your fly swatter story. Your fly swatter.
Oh, yeah, the fly swatter.
Yeah, when you were Ray had some problem that they had a flight where they needed to knock the icicle.
There was a switch on a satellite that had not triggered properly.
Big satellite looking out our overhead window, and we launched the satellite. Huge thing comes out of the payload bay. It's drifting there. It's supposed to spin up. Well, it didn't spin up, and it was supposed to have an antenna that would pop out on top, so it could communicate with the ground. So we looked out there, and the little thing on top didn't pop up. And they said, well, we think there may be a way that you can save this thing. There's a little switch. And of course, we had all gone out to the facility where this thing was built, and, we had looked it over, and we thought we knew what they were talking about, the switch. So, we thought, and they said, well, the only single point failure here is that switch. Well, we look out at this huge thing, and it's beginning to circle around, and there's a little thing sticking out on the side. And we thought, oh, that must be the switch. So they said, well, maybe we can make that switch come to the on position. So I thought, how are we going to do that? And so they said, well, you've got to tug on that switch. We've got to make some sort of contraption to help you tug on that switch. So they sent us up this picture. Believe it or not, you know, they were trying to describe to us how they wanted this little device, which we started calling a fly swatter, that, you know, that there must be a way that we can snag that switch on the side. So they were trying to describe to us in words how to build this thing. Well, we couldn't understand what they were talking about. We just, you know, it just sounded strange. Well, what they did, we had a teleprinter on board, you know, and it sent out reams of paper, and they used the numbers on this piece of paper to draw a picture for us, what they thought this fly swatter ought to look like. And so we cut it up, and, you know, here's these reams of paper that we're trying to cut sections out of. And we thought, well, it's going to, you know, the paper's not going to work for it to try and swat something. So we took our plastic book covers, and, you know, they were plastic book covers that had our checklists, and, you know, we put the piece of paper on it and drew what we were supposed to draw, and we had these little panels, and we were supposed to take the plastic and scrape it alongside this satellite that was spinning around, and try to snag that, to tug that switch into the on position. So here we go, we're trying to do that. And, you know, I'm looking out the overhead window, maneuvering the arm, trying to get this piece of plastic to scrape along the side of this huge rotating satellite. Well, we happened to have the first politician in space on that flight. He was down on the middeck with one of the other crew members, and I can remember I'm, you know, looking out the window. I looked at the inner deck access, and here are two sets of eyeballs looking up at me, watching this thing going around and around, and so I'm going, holy smokes. You know, I thought, surely this is not going to work. Well, we managed to snag that switch multiple times, and just didn't work, so we were going to have to just let go of the satellite and let it float away. Well, it turned out that that was not the switch that had failed. Apparently, when the satellite came out of the payload bay, there was a switch down on the bottom that was held down when the satellite was on top of it, and when the satellite came out of the payload bay, that switch came to the on position. So the satellite did get turned on, but needless to say, it was quite an adventure just trying to get to that point. Well, that satellite, you know, was non-operational, and a crew had to go up later and do a spacewalk to grab it and put it in the payload bay and bring it home. So it was useful, but it was quite an adventure for all of us on board, watching this thing go round and round.
I could talk to you all evening, but I'm going to have to draw us to a close. I'm going to ask the last question as a kind of short answer. Looking at the young people in the crowd, and I know that we have at least 1,000 people online with us tonight, what advice would you give to the next generation?
I would say don't let anybody ever edit your dreams. What you're interested in, what you dream about, that's yours. Some people may voice their opinion, but no one gets to edit your dreams. And if you back them up with hard work and persistence, you might be surprised how far you can go.
Yes, I agree. Persistence is really a valuable thing when you follow a dream. And just remember, I try to tell young folks that, you know, what dreams you have, don't let anyone tell you that you can't do them. And sometimes you may have to change the direction a little bit, but be persistent, and eventually you'll find what you want and what you're good at, and achieve what your goals.
Well, you know, it takes a village. And for all of us, you know, we know that we can't do it alone. We can't even do it in small groups. It's going to take a village to accomplish all the things that we hope to in the future. So I think we need for everybody to become a part of that village and reach for the stars.
You can't do better than that.
Kathy, thank you, Anna, thank you, Ray, and thank you, Margaret. Just fabulous. Listen, as you said, Margaret, we could go all night listening to this. Thanks again to our partners and friends at Boeing for their generous support of this program. Certainly want to thank you for your time tonight. I do apologize for some of the audio challenges at the outset. We will do better in the future. And speaking of the future, if you enjoyed tonight's program, we hope you'll attend or tune in to our 2 upcoming Aviation Adventures lectures, both taking place at the museum downtown in D.C. and streamed on YouTube. Next Wednesday, we will explore how Congressman Charles Diggs fought for equal opportunities for Black Americans in commercial aviation. And later this fall, on October 26, we'll share the stories of the often overlooked contributions of Pan Am stewardesses to the geopolitical crises of the 1960s and the 1970s. You can sign up to attend both programs on our website. Thank you again for your time and interest tonight, and a special thanks to our guests and our panelists for sharing with us this remarkable history, this remarkable story. Thank you so much. Have a great evening and a safe drive home.